Well, hello again. It's David here with Finn, who's anxiously waiting for me to throw the ball on a lovely summer's morning. Sun's just coming up, and we're here today to talk about these things: Denison Smock, the parachutist smock, and some of the interesting stories and history behind that. Because why this came about, it was when we talked about the multi-terrain pattern, you may recall. When we were talking about that some time ago, I mentioned about the fact that the British Army had used camouflage uniforms in the Second World War, and this very distinctive patterns that you can see on the Denisons, etc. But raised my eyebrow slightly because, of course, we don't know this Major Denison. He doesn't seem to actually be able to be pin him down. That lots of stories about, you know, he's a guy that designed it, hence Denison Smock, etc. And so what are we going to do about that one? So we thought we'd have a closer look. And I thought to start with two really nice chaps who I met at Capel, who I said, look, can you just tell us why this, number one, the fascination, anything we do know about the Denisons? Andy and Tom, two reenactors, and you may know them in other contexts as well. But they very kindly had a word with me back then, a few weeks back, about Denison. So let's go over to them to start with. Can I just ask you then, first of all, introduce yourselves and what your group is?
Yes, so my name's Andy Bryant, and this is Tom Sellen, and we're with the group Men of Arnhem Living History Group. We're here at Capel Military Show, portraying units from 1st Airborne Division and the Glider Pilot Regiment.
So one of the obvious things I can see is you're dressed as what? Glider Pilot Regiment, British Paratrooper, and it's that outfit you're wearing, which is the Denison Smock, that really, okay, the round AFE helmet could have been, you know, it was used dispatch ride, other things, sort of thing, with a different liner. But that's that item that really identifies you, isn't it? And tell us a little bit about that Denison Smock you're wearing.
So the Denison Smock is, well, in my opinion, I suppose most people would agree, is fairly iconic. Like you say, a bit like the helmet or maybe the maroon beret. But the Denison Smock is an incredible item, really. And it came with the development of really modern warfare in World War II. During the Second World War, we really see airborne operations, of course, starting. The Germans play a huge part in the development of that style of warfare. And they bring in their own special equipment for those fighting men. And the British Army see that they've really got a gap to fill. They haven't got an equivalent. So what we're wearing today, the Denison Smock, is based loosely on what the Germans actually would have used. The original first pattern was a step-in, just like they used. And then naturally, it evolves as we start to realise that maybe that's not so practical. But yeah, what it does is it offers you almost a second layer of webbing. So, of course, most would know that the webbing is the load-carrying equipment that we'd wear over the top of this. Originally, the Smock was designed to go over the top of that. But what you'll find is, yeah, we'll wear our webbing over the top of this today, but you've got all these extra pockets, areas that you can store more equipment. Of course, it allows the flap underneath to stop from riding up when we jump. And yeah, just a wonderful piece of kit. And amazingly, I think one of the biggest parts of it is that this is the sort of thing Grandad actually had hanging up under the stairs after the war. There's a lot of us here today who are involved in this because of family members who fought in the Second World War. We grew up with the movies, and yeah, so many of these garments survived to go on to be used for fishing and dog walking. And madly, when you consider the value of those today, it's quite incredible, really. These guys had no idea the worth of the kit that they were running around Europe in. 80 years ago. But yeah, today we stand here in some of the finest quality reproductions made by Steve Kiddle, name drop. But yeah, an awesome piece of kit.
So, and can I just ask you as well, because obviously it really looks the part, but so you mentioned family, but also were you drawn to reenacting this thing because of that look of the paratrooper in World War II?
For sure. It's an interesting thing for me because my time as a living historian, I think for you, it's kind of evolved. You start with certain units based on sometimes family connections, and then for me, it just evolved because I met so many veterans, and you meet the veterans, and of course, for me, initially doing stuff like airborne units, it kind of felt like something I didn't really want to touch on because am I worthy of it? You know, that's always the problem is, am I worthy of wearing it? But when you see the responses that we get from veterans and their families and current serving paras, you know, at Duxford Air Show and in Merville Battery in June, you know, you get a response that actually I didn't realise I would get. And suddenly, I feel like, okay, this is somewhat acceptable and we're doing it for the right reason. Yeah. For me, it's about keeping that history alive.
So can I also ask as well, would you, you know, I always use the phrase dog walking coat, would you wear your Denison just for a little drop walk down the street bit or something?
I personally regularly wear mine.
Yeah, and I'm the same, especially when you get them and they're brand new and you want to wear them in a little bit. You want to make, like, you don't want to age them because they're not supposed to look 80 years old because they would have been issued brand new at some point. But you want to weather them. You want to wear them in. So I wear mine at home.
Okay, and I'm going to say that one because to me, they are, whatever else you're looking at around here, everybody likes all these different bits and pieces. They have a practicality.
Absolutely.
You know, you could wear them, you can put your packed lunch in, you can do your bits and pieces that way, as well as if someone knows what you're wearing, I bet they've passed you and they say, have you got Denison, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, to be fair, with the quality of the Steve Kiddle smock, we do get asked a lot, is that an original?
Yeah.
And I've had one of these smocks next to an original, and obviously the original is 80 years old, so it's faded, but everything else about these smocks are spot on.
It's a conversation starter. You go to the pub and that's it. Somebody spots you and that's it. You've made a new friend and you're there talking about, you know, the longest day or a bridge too far, and you just go down that hole because of the jacket you chose towards the pub.
It does. So it's got cultural connotations. It's got things that come with that item that's way beyond, I would argue, certain other ones. And it's also like you're in the know. If someone tells you that, isn't it? It's that little bit of extra. Oh, is that a Denison? Okay, and that type of a line, people do that. One last question, which you've answered in that business about the background to it. So you've given me the history there. Do you know anything about this Major Denison or Captain Denison? About any? Have you heard any stories of those ones?
I don't personally know, other than he was the guy that obviously gave his name to the Denison Smock. So he was obviously the guy that was principally behind the design of it. Other than that, I'm ashamed to say I don't.
This is the problem with the hobby, though. Is I think we're all in this desperate, like I certainly am. I'm thriving to know more and more and more. But you get kind of, you go to a show like We Have Ways that we have done, you know, in the past, and you get there and people ask questions and you think, well, I've never actually been asked that, and I never imagined I'd ever be asked that. So it's one of those moments where you go away from this now and you think, well, I'm gonna have to read up on it. I'm curious, you know. But you know, that's the thing, is there's so much to learn.
So come back to us next year and we'll be able to tell you a lot more.
Now, after I'd done that earlier film on multi-terrain pattern camouflage, John Baker at the Airborne Assault Museum that's based at Duxford, he very kindly got in touch with me and said, look, there is another story here that obviously I was slightly indicating towards, and would you like to come and have a chat about it? And so, lovely invitation. So we took John up on that and off we went up to Duxford, and boy, what an interesting conversation that turned out to be. So here we are with John Baker at the Airborne Assault Museum.
Correct.
Did I say that correctly
this
time? I did, got it wrong the first time. And John has very kindly offered to host us here to have a look at the Denison issue. So John, thank you so much for letting us come and have a look. And we're in this is kind of your archive offices?
We are, we're in a place the public don't normally get to see. So this is our original sort of wartime building on the other side of the site at Duxford. This was originally a women's block, allegedly called Virgin Villas during the war.
Wow.
And we know it was a women's block because all the glass is frosted out to stop the men peeking in.
As if they would do
As if they would. But we occupy the bottom floor here with our archive, our libraries, where we do all our research work. It's where our team work, very small team, just 2.5 people, delivering a service to 150,000 physical visitors a year and 1 million digital visitors.
Wow.
So fairly busy for the team.
Right. We can come back to that because I always like talking about, what museums are there for,
Yeah.
what they're after. The story, and this is the one that explaining how, from the point of view of the average enthusiast, we've talked about Denisons, etc. I've done it. I quite like questioning myself sometimes about where did we get this from.
Yeah.
You guys have been telling a different story for quite some time, and thank you for getting in touch about that, because this idea, we know we've got doubts about things. I mentioned that doubt. You've taken this a fair bit further, haven't you, with the whole Denison story?
Yeah, we have. We've been looking at this now for approximately 15 years. So one of the first things I did here was obviously audit the collection, see what we had. And I was just amazed by the sheer volume of Denison Smocks in the collection, all with provenance, all showing detailed differences in production, colour, the way the patination is on them. And we soon realised it's not as simple as perhaps you would initially think. We also started to question everything we knew about them. Why does the label say Denison? Why is this name on there when it doesn't match any other naming convention at that period for Army standards? So that sent us down a rabbit hole of, was Denison a person, which is the perceived history? There's a Major Denison, therefore he was involved in the design, therefore it's named after Denison. The problem with that is that Major Denison, spelled with two N's, wasn't serving at the period these smocks were designed. So it'd be very unlikely for him to be involved in that design process. As we then go through the records, we also realised the initial smocks issued, of course, were the step-ins, which are much different and a direct copy of the German step-in type smock. So then how did they transition from that step-in into what we call the Denison? And then we realised there was an interim of a smock called a Windac, which suddenly appeared between the step-in and the Denison. So for 15 years, we've been trying to bottom that out through original documentation, through research, through being down at the National Archives, going through company archives, and it's a long-winded process, but we think we're most of the way there. We're not saying definitively we've got 100% of the information, and if anybody watching this would care to comment below if they think there's an alternative story or they've heard something different, we will read all of those. We won't necessarily comment on all of them, but we'll certainly take it all on board.
That's really interesting because, as I said, I just get that feeling that we have received wisdom, even though we have doubts. And my one was, coming from a fine art background, I looked into the Oliver Messel, the camouflage story, the unit, etc. And of course, it doesn't add up to, and I was trying to find, I don't know if you know, where did we think that first idea of this Major or Captain Denison, sometimes I've seen two references, and he worked with the camouflage unit with Oliver Messel. Where do you think that came from? Because it is repeated very often.
It is.
But to try and find the source of that, sometimes, when you're looking into something, you see an obvious mistake, why it's gone that way, or a miscaptioned image that everyone still repeats. Do we know where the Oliver Messel bit and this camouflage unit, do we think?
We spent quite a lot of time looking into this, and particularly the camouflage aspect, because we were hoping the records there would perhaps lead us in a specific way. But what we soon realised was everything at the start of the formation of airborne forces was massively rushed.
Right.
So there's not always an audit trail associated with every decision made. So when airborne forces were formed, you had General Browning coming in, the father of airborne forces, a really good organiser, a really good guy at marketing. And he was very keen for airborne forces to have a very specific identity. And that even translates across to the uniforms they wear. He himself designed his own service dress, which was very much a sort of World War I flap over Army Air Corps. He wanted all paratroopers to wear that into battle. So he took that keen interest. Where we couldn't find a link was Denison to camouflage. We could not find that link, and we were looking at everybody who was in what was called the dungeon party, who were the guys that set up airborne forces. We did wonder, was it a corruption of various people's surnames? Take the first two letters of one, the middle of another. None of them would quite fit Denison. Where we think the link comes into the camouflage department is in 1941, there was an exercise in Cambridgeshire. The first parachute, the second SAS, or as a lot of people call it, 11 SAS, but it's actually Roman numerals 2 SAS because they came from number 2 commando. They parachuted into Erith. They then marched on Norwich, where they undertook a training exercise assaulting Norwich Castle. Now, who else was in Norwich at that point? A camouflage department. Now, we wonder, is there a link between these guys assaulting the castle dressed in plain khaki step-in smocks, not ideal camouflage? Was there a link up there between the camouflage department and the paras to think, can they improve what they're wearing? Because what they were wearing was just based on what the Germans walked for, which was just this plain smock. Have we got proof of that yet? No, we haven't got proof of that yet. But where we think there is a link goes back to a guy who was in the dungeon party called Colonel Blacker. Now, Blacker is also known for other things, the Blacker Bombard and all these other inventions, a bit of a wacky character, who in the 1930s undertook a flight over Mount Everest. And when he did the flight over Mount Everest, he wore a windproof smock. And it was designed by a company called BWT. And that company specialized in this windproof gabardine material. And Blacker was then part of the dungeon party. He was speaking to Browning. There is definitely correspondence between General Browning and BWT as a manufacturer to ask them to look into designing a unique piece of equipment, clothing, for airborne troops. And from that, we lead into what is known as the Windac smock, which we have over here. So it's a high quality windproof piece of material. It's called a Windac because it's windproof. And the guy who owned the company, Brian Taylor, he liked the term Kodak and thought it was very popular. So he just added "ac" to the end of wind, hence the Windac smock, produced under an Air Ministry contract. So there's an Air Ministry label in the back, and we can perhaps get you a shot of that later. So this Windac was on a very limited production run, but you can see it's using a very specific type of camouflage material. And we believe that camouflage material is off the shelf, i.e. commercially available, potentially named Falconia. And we're still researching that quite deeply. This bit of material, this gabardine-esque, not particularly robust. You'll see there's a lot of damage on the sort of cuffs and in that. So if guys are sort of advancing through forested areas, etc., branches, it's going to get quite torn up, but it is an exceptionally good piece of equipment. But this is essentially what Blacker wore crossing Mount Everest in the 1930s, and then the design has been refined with camouflage material by BWT and proposed as the smock solution for the paras. So you've got a tie-in between Norwich Castle, a camouflage department, a crazy 1930s explorer, and General Browning, who loved marketing and unique identity.
And of course, we think of Browning in a Windac smock, don't we, as well, because of that idea of, we used to say phrases, I say we, those of us erroneous, used to say phrases like officer's pattern.
Officer's zip through
because it
smock.
has exactly, the bit of wool around the neck.
Yeah.
It's with a different label.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that Windac label.
Yeah.
It's a different item, isn't it?
Yeah. 100% a different item, completely different material. In a black and white photo with webbing on, are you necessarily going to notice it? No. I suspect most people remember this type of smock with the light collar from Sean Connery in A Bridge Too Far. If you want to see Browning's original one, it's in the Hartenstein Museum in Holland. Well worth a visit, fantastic museum. Now, we have correspondence between BWT and Browning, and we get the distinct impression that Browning actually paid for the limited production run of these.
Right.
Now, there is a picture of one platoon in one 1st Parachute Battalion wearing these. They are never seen in them again.
Right.
The only people who are ever seen wearing these are senior officers. And I suspect somebody said they're far too good for the men.
Yeah.
So you'll see General Gale, you'll see Field Marshal Montgomery wearing one of these.
Yeah.
So they definitely ended up in the hands of senior officers. But then you have a transition to what's next to it, which is what we know as a Denison smock, because that's what the label says. It says clearly, Smock Airborne Troops, Denison. And that's what people have assumed for the last 80 plus years. And you'll see there's a distinct difference between the two. Browning was not happy that poor old BWT didn't get the contract. BWT probably didn't have the manufacturing capacity to actually produce the amount of smocks needed. By the end of the Second World War, over 100,000 men had passed through RAF Ringway on parachute training courses. That's a lot of manufacturing capability you're going to need. Then you add in glider-borne troops, specialist troops, Marine commandos, exactly. So the production run would have been masses, and in the end covered a huge amount of manufacturers across the UK. So there is a decision taken somewhere in government to produce a cheaper alternative to the Windac. It has many of the design attributes, the large pockets. It has the what's called the beaver tail, which is you can attach the tail to the front. Now, originally, again, the assumption here is this is there to stop the parachute, stop your smock riding up while you're parachuting. But of course, if you're wearing a parachute,
You've got your harness anyway.
your harness is tight on there. Speaking to the son of the original designer, he said this is very unique to his dad's design. It's to keep you warm in the aircraft,
Right.
which is why there's a tail associated with it. You'll also notice there's a difference in pattern, and we believe the government did not want to pay for the off-the-shelf camouflage pattern,
Right.
and instead,
Which is probably copyrighted.
which is probably copyright to BWT or some other manufacturer. There'd have been a cost associated with replicating that. However, you will see this come in later. So these initial run, you can see here, are very, very different. The pattern is much more almost watercolor-esque on there. But again, this has led to a huge amount of myths. And you'll see a lot of references early on where they're talking about these were designed, you could parachute into France. If you're behind enemy lines, you could then wash them out and pretend to be a French farmer. It's just not true. It makes no sense whatsoever. No French farmer is going to be seen in a piece of material washed out like this with a vague camouflage pattern on it. The material is very much denim. It has gone from the gabardine there to the denim here. And I think here we can probably start to think about where the name Denison came from. In the Second World War, all military equipment was named after what it was made from. You know, you think about webbing, you think about battle dress, it's always got serge associated with it. You think about webbing, it's, you know, anklets, webbing, anklets, canvas, etc., etc. Everything is named after what it's made out of. Exceptions back in the Victorian era, Sam Browne belts and, you know, Wellington boots, etc., etc. The only thing we can think of named in the Second World War after its creators were the Fairbairn Sykes knives.
Right.
Everything else, particularly uniform-wise, is named after what it's made out of.
Yeah.
And there is a distinct transition from gabardine to denim.
Right. And denims, because of the two-piece outfit, it's a very familiar term in the British military.
Yeah.
You have your battle dress serge, but you also have denims, which copy the same pattern for daily workwear, good use, regular washing.
Very robust
Material, etc. So we join those things.
We join those dots together. Now you could say, well, where is your evidence of that? Well, we are very lucky to hold a lot of the original design documentation for the smocks, both here and in sources at the National Archives. So in the National Archives, if anybody wants to go down and go through all the Medical Research Council papers, you will find references to the design of these, and they are always referenced as parachutist smock and then defined by the material next to it. So it's parachutist smock, drill, parachutist smock, camouflage.
Right.
So there were two distinct designs of this. One was just a plain olive drab, one was going to be camouflage, and it mirrors the trousers as well, but they're always referenced as parachutist smock and then the type of material and the weight of the material next to it. There is no reference to a man called Denison within those papers.
So do we, and I'm stealing your sandwiches here, that idea that the word denim has come in is a spelling corruption because it's become Denison as someone's misdone, miswritten, and we've seen that in lots of other evidence of things being copied out that don't work in the right way.
Correct.
As in, people make mistakes.
People do make mistakes. And you look at the type of handwriting you had back in that era, it's a clerk transcribing from one document to another, and Denison to denim. And we've tried this numerous times in the office, and perhaps you can show some examples in the film. You can see there is a corruption that's very easily made when you're producing this type of label. So we have no evidence of anybody called Denison, but we do know this is made out of denim.
Right, and to me that was that revelatory moment when you got in touch, that it suddenly explains so much, because what is this Denison? We know he doesn't exist in the way that we think. Where are these, you know, so as we all know, if you're in this, you're in the museum, this idea about where myths have picked up. Yeah, it's so hard to kill, but I'm not sure if, you know, these ideas about where it first came from who do we repeat? Because great names have said it, all of us sat here for so long, you know, Brian L. Davis in the books, everything, all of that stuff. But that idea that it just stems, it's not a person, it's a spelling mistake, it doesn't change, you know.
It's still a Denison Smocks.
It's exactly from that point of view, because that's what the name that was put on it, that way it gets stuck to it. And but what a great, to me, and the fact you were saying this story on your website from what, you know, 2010 or something or other, you know, but it doesn't get out there because we still have that same old, if I'm not careful, I just say, oh, he worked with this or something, you know, the camouflage unit. Or,
I mean, it's 80 years of history you're trying to correct. I don't know if correct is the right word, or trying to influence them, you know, good, honest research.
No,
we're trying to avoid collectorisms and reenactorisms and, you know, as good as those guys are and all the work they do in preserving things, we're working from source material. We're putting our Sherlock Holmes hat on as we look at this stuff. We're questioning everything that's ever been said before.
And that for me is the pleasure of coming here today, to hear and see that, because if anyone has doubts on these things, you know, when we need convincing, and we do, because we're all doubting Thomases, my goodness, there it is in front of you, number one. Number two is the logic of suddenly the revelatory look at the words, and that word denim, and then the way that we were using it was so common for the military at the time. So it's bound, you know, that to me adds up in a certain way. And also that sense that we've all got to be open-minded as in working in museums as well, because new evidence constantly comes to light. And as we talked about earlier, you've got to be cynical sometimes and questioning, how do we get there? Where's that come from? Because sometimes we take received wisdom, we've used that phrase, I have all that time, and yet someone comes along and suddenly pops your bubble, and you're going, why, whoa, hang on, why didn't I see that before? And that, to me, you know, is part of the pleasure of the subject as well, isn't it? That we're learning all the time.
And we're very privileged to be in a position where we can sit and look at the original documents. And we're coming in, you know, fresh to the subject. When I first came into the, I was previously working with the Inc. or at Chicksands. You come in here and you think, what do I immediately associate with Paris? And it's maroon berets. And of course, Daphne du Maurier introduced maroon beret, which again is another complete myth, you know, and it's Denison Smocks, and it's what you look into, and you gradually tease the information out of original documents. You get time to speak to manufacturers, you get time to go to the National Archives, and it's pulling all of these sources together to get a much clearer picture. Are we 100% there yet? No, we've still got much more research to do with this, but we're determined to actually bottom out and get the definitive history out for these smocks.
And you said earlier, because I was making a different video, that comment or that point about that enormous collector's market, the reenactors, the enthusiasts, the person who's got what.
Keep all the interest going.
Absolutely, because you come across things, they'll be at that market stall, they'll see that pile of letters somewhere that add something. So again, all I would say is this, you're keen on that. So that idea of what have you come by, or if he was the person telling you, was it just an old reenacting actor telling you a story, or actually where have we got those layers that we can find something else? Because I often go on about, you're lucky, you've got a wonderful collection of Denisons here, but that national collection is out there still, isn't it? There's so many people who've got it in the family, or they've collected over time, or they've got a great story. I always say, please write the story, put it in the pocket, so we know where it came from, what that thing is. But that feeding into, and I won't say it's got to be just one central source, but that idea that if you are going to be a repository, you're charitable aims, you're here for the long term, why not think of the museum as a place that needs to know and ought to, if you've got something special, why not give it to the museum as well, you know, or at least offer it.
And that's great advice, you know. Yeah, so what I'd say is anybody thinking about donating to the Regimental Museum is get in touch. You know, we're very enthusiastic. We want definitive examples of everything. We think it's great things are out there in the hands of collectors, etc. But we need those definitive ones here to tell the story. We need to look at the design differences, the changes during manufacture, the changes in camouflage pattern, and tackle some of the sort of myths that have grown up about it. You know, so if Grandad was in Airborne Forces and he made a diary about when he first got issued something, that's critical information to come into here. You know, it's great just to see things and talk to the public. They come to see us, and you know, we'll sit down with their collection. We'll say that's very useful for us. Perhaps that's more suitable for your family, etc. And we're very open about what we need and what we don't need. In particular, all museums have been guilty of over collecting in the past.
So, but that idea of have that conversation, because there might be something there, and also you are set up for the longer term. We are going to look after this, and it won't suddenly appear on eBay when you know the family falls apart or someone needs money for whatever. But you just mentioned there as well, because one of the areas I know we talked about was the camouflage issue.
Yes.
Again, a textile historian, someone who knows about what was going on in the factories in the 40s, because one of those other things that, again, doubts in my mind, this idea of brush painting.
Yeah, we looked at that quite extensively. When we produced our book on the Denison with Ollie and Bruce, fantastic book. If you can get a copy, it's got everything in there. We looked at the manufacturing process quite clearly. We worked out if these were hand printed in the volume they needed, you would need kilometre-long production facilities of ladies with brushes.
Yes.
So we looked at all the various types of printing process available at the time. We believe there was a machine that sprayed the pattern onto the material and then was followed with rollers.
Right.
And the reason we've come to that conclusion is we're lucky enough here to have a version with a manufacturing error.
Ah, okay, right.
So on the back here, you can see where the spray has been made, but the brush has not followed through.
Right.
To produce the brush.
So we've got a splatter, but not a brush.
Not a brush. And here you can see an interruption in the actual production. There's a stop there before it moves on again. So the pattern tries to replicate as well as it can the off-the-shelf pattern in a slightly cheaper way of doing it, but we don't think this was done by hand at all. This is very much manufactured. And you do occasionally spot repeats in the patternation. There is no way you could get this unique by hand.
Okay, got you. Right. So, and that to me is another one where if somebody's got, if we can find out who was doing the cloth manufacture, who could, do those records still exist in a county archive
or even at the manufacturers themselves, if they're still going up north.
Where do we find that? Because that to me is another one of those where we've got a doubt, we're not too sure, but we enter into other people's subject areas in some ways, don't we? And that would be a textile historian would maybe come along and say, you're kidding yourselves. No, they've never do it that way. By the way, it was all done. Or by the way, have you actually seen the records of this company show they were doing this in the quantity? So back to your point, you're going to need a lot of people standing there with brushes to do that type of thing. And
it'd be very wasteful. Imagine the sheer, there's shortages at the time of both material, paint, dye, people themselves. It doesn't correlate when there were machines that could do this.
And you've got that print process going on, which you know about for the later pattern sort of thing that we see it starting to appear that way.
And we know this wasn't designed to be washed out. This was produced, and I mentioned early on, things happen very, very quickly at the formation of airborne forces. They needed to get things produced. They were getting masses of men getting trained. They needed their equipment. This was seen as the way of getting them equipped with their camouflaged object and uniform before they first went into action.
So you've got as well those original drawings of how one was going to be constructed and what it went together, which again I find fascinating because again back to this source of, because again we mentioned earlier things that we always talk about, the tail to go between the legs and everything. Actually, they were on some of these designs in the 30s, etc. So the idea of whether it's to keep yourself warm, to stop things snagging, but not necessarily parachute jumping because we've got that there. But it becomes an identifiable feature.
It does.
And when as well that we've talked in other areas about things like alley kit, the modern soldier, why they do things in a certain way. And we all think it's got to have a great big nose because it looks cool.
Yeah.
And when are those moments that this is such an identifiable issue with the paratroopers thing that, okay, we don't use it that much, but the lads love it. So, I'm never too sure when these things come into play. And because we know it happens now, surely it must have happened then to a degree, but hard to prove, I imagine.
I think so. You do occasionally see these that have been tailored. Clearly guys have fitted belts on the inside. The big complaint about this during the war from the original documentation we have, all the post-combat reports, is where's the belt?
Okay.
And a lot of guys did convert it with like a piece of string on the inside or a bit of elastic to put it in at the waist slightly. Was it as alley then as it is now? Everybody wanted to keep hold of their smock when they demobbed, which would suggest it was seen as a cool thing. But it's also quite a good bit of workwear. So a lot of guys going back into manual labour or, working in fields, etc. Still a useful thing to keep a hold of post-war. But certainly the alley look, as Paras would call it, does stem from these very early ones. And they still issue a full zip-through smock today. And you'll see different companies and different battalions fold the smock, complete it in a different way, and they have to have a 44 or an older pattern belt in order to look cool. And when they go off duty, the belt goes around the neck and the bags come out.
So brand new beret, they'll spend time shaving it, doing whatever, make it look like it's been around a long time. So all of those, I find all that sort of stuff, because again, that idea that if we feel that, they did to a certain extent. And the other thing, without overdoing it, it has been this overused word, iconic, but it is. And not just because of all of us fascinated in the subject area, or whether it's a bridge too far in the war movies and everything. It's remanufactured for all the reenactors, but the dog walking coat. One of the guys I spoke to, reenactor, says if you wear this in the pub, someone walks over and always sings out the side of most, whatever, and they know what it is. And of course, every other military across the world, we copied the Germans, but not the Germans. It's our Denison Smock now has led to all of those imitations, if you want to put it that way. But it's led on, and that's I'm a paratrooper, I'm something special, or whatever.
It's become an international design.
Simple,
NATO kind of adopted a model post-war, and you associate these immediately with paratroopers, and paratroopers love having their own identity. They like to set themselves apart from everybody else. So it's absolutely iconic for airborne troops to have this kind of style. And during the war itself, it kind of transitioned, it didn't stay steady. You had the early ones with knitted cuffs. Later on, you get a version with just a button cuff and a sort of more raglan type sleeve. It's just designed to ease the manufacturing process. And of course, the beauty of having the collection here is we keep examples of all of those, and we can see that transition. And you often get what you call the end of one production run and the start of another. So you'll see here you've got the sort of painted version, which we know was from a machine rather than a person. It mirrors in certain aspects the pattern you see on that one there. But as you turn this example around, the front of the smock, suddenly the material changes and you're back to
this new,
and clearly somebody at the War Department went, this isn't working, why don't we just buy this? And it transitions. So you got the last production run of this type, and then the front of the smock is in the newer material, which is you associate generally with Denisons throughout the war, albeit you get slight design changes.
And there's another story here, isn't there? Which is who wears the smock.
And it's obviously it looks incredibly tatty, but this belonged to a guy called James Walker. And in his para-battalion, he'd already earned himself a BEM for saving his men during a chaining exercise when a grenade was dropped. And he saved the section he was with, so he got his BEM. He then took part in Normandy and finally at the Rhine crossing. During the Rhine crossing, he was actually machine gunned across his chest, but did survive. And they obviously cut the smock off you, get a clasp knife out of your pocket, that's sliced off you so the medic can get to the wounds. Walkup was heard to say, don't take my smock, because obviously it would have just been discarded, bloody, and then they get burned. This was put on him as a blanket as he was stretchered away. And then post-war, he did some very basic stitching to it, and he wore this to do his gardening.
You see, and again, for me, that's the difference between an item that, if it loses that history, what a shame, which is why I say to everyone, write it out. Where did you get it? Where did you wear it? Is this your one? Where did the story?
Keep it associated.
Absolutely, because that's a wreck of a smock until you tell that story. And then it becomes a historical
and in fact, it could just be
value.
It could just be seen as a tatty smock. It could end up in the skip somewhere, as opposed to being preserved. And the other nice thing about this is, and I will just tell the viewers, we have very clean hands.
I do that all every time. So actually,
in this one, you have padding stitched into the shoulders.
So spreading the load.
Spreading the load. And it was very common to find this inside smocks during the Second World War. We've got several examples with it stitched in. The Americans issued it to put over the wedding, but the British guys stitched it directly inside. So it's only by the museum holding these that we can track the history of the patternation change, end of production runs, start of other production runs. And there were so many companies producing these across the UK that you see detailed differences between them. You see a Gordon company one, they're very badly stitched.
Okay.
You know, somebody can hold me up a smock and I go, oh, that's a Frankenstein or that's a Gordon's, and we can just spot
get
them.
your eyes in.
Once you get your eye in, you can see it. And because these continue to be issued post-war, and gradually the pattern changed, then you move into 59, you've got a whole variety of camouflage, and perhaps we can show you some of those to cut into the film as well. And they're still issued today, but in MTP.
Yeah.
Completely unique, still for, just Paris to wear, full zip through now rather than the overhead.
Yeah.
Which was another criticism a lot of the guys had, it's quite hot in Northwest Europe, even in 1944. You got your string vest, your woolly shirt, your BD underneath this, plus that on top.
Yeah.
It's a fairly hot thing to wear. Although people back in those days were used to wearing lots of layers and lots of woolly clothes.
No central heating, no
exactly.
other things that way. So.
Exactly. So, yeah.
All I can say is, John, thank you so much for showing us that. You've got these on displays in the gallery, so all I would say is come and see the real thing.
Fantastic.
And I hope as well that this does trigger, if there is people out there with something extra to give on the subject, please do get in touch.
And do comment and share and let us know.
Put those things in, because sometimes we all get side, we think everyone's seen that reference, seen those things, so fine, but do that, share the knowledge, pass these things on, because I think as well, we're only recipients of this moment in time, aren't we? So that idea that somebody else coming with new information, new evidence, etc. And why I bang on about this one, because it's true, that's why we love the subject, because this is one we think we know about, or do we, as I said, but think of all those other things out there, which I know so many people have talked about, written about, researched, enthused about. Don't let that just die on your hard drive. Make sure that information ends up somewhere, that someone can look after that and share that knowledge as well, as you've done so expertly today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for you and your team here who've put this on and found that bit out, because now that's made me much more knowledgeable. And I just hope this gets to an awful lot of people that the next time they're stopping you, I saw that Denison thing, I'm not sure about, or my one is. But that's great.
We welcome it. Come and debate. It's great. If you've got a different idea or some documentary evidence, share it, and we'll absorb it into the overall history of these iconic pieces of uniform.
Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Lovely.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
So as you can see, that was a very, very interesting visit certainly for me, and I hope for you, if you followed this one all the way through, that how interesting you'll find that as well, especially if you're a bit of a collector, or the stories, or you love reading around airborne forces, etc. And for me, it does a number of things. Number one, it takes you back to basics, ask the questions. If we come out with phrases and things all the time, absolutely great, fine, but when's the time we might want to question some of those things? And if we've got a doubt, where do we go to the right sources to find out? And equally, how we can quite happily go along with a number of sources for an awful long time without necessarily asking the most basic and the obvious, who was that person? Why do we use this phrase? What does that really mean about things? Are we sure that the sources we've always been quoting all that time, what was their agenda and why when they were doing that? Was it, as we often say here, I always say that line, history only happened one way, but how we have it recorded, how we remember it, what evidence comes to life, etc., it does change over time. So inevitably, how that's interpreted, we go back to it for different reasons. And sometimes, we're looking at things that, again, new evidence is always coming to light. So as John says, and as we were discussing there before, if you think you've got further information or sources or point this way, and you're happy to share, because I think that's a benefit to all of us. If we're, when we find pockets of information, knowledge, experience, whatever it is that we can share together in these areas, that all benefits. And where does ultimate repositories for that? That's why I still would argue the museums, the regimental, the core museums, the greater ones, etc. All those different types of places, they are a really good place for this information to end up, because they tend to be there for the longer term. and it's for public benefit. They're distributing it all. It's not just, you know, me type thing. It's out there for everybody to actually enjoy, share and learn from and exchange, etc. So again, as John said, if you do have that, those stories, that bit of information, remember the other side is, of course, the museum's not there to value your stuff for you. So just don't start sending off emails saying, how much is this worth? That's the auction houses or dealers. They'll do that. That's not the role of a museum. But if there are things they might be able to help with, or as we said, you know, you've got information, is this, before it goes in the bin or the attic again, what's there that might be worth sort of passing on. Now it did, one of the things, it made me get up in my attic, which is always a bit of a trauma for me as I'm getting older, but I dug out what I got from many moons ago when I was first collecting back in the 80s and then the 90s. And so here's my first pattern Denison knitted cuffs, as I say, if we're going to call these first pattern these days, with its, this one I think has never been issued, which is in good order. And luckily the mice haven't seemed to got at it while it was up in the attics. A couple of others here. And for me, that really interesting little moment now, because again, back to knowledge. So this was a parachutist oversmock. We didn't really talk about that this much, but when I looked at this, now all of a sudden, because of that conversation with John, look at the zip. It actually runs at an angle across the front. And as soon as I saw that again, after the conversation, I was then thinking, hang on, that's got a relationship, hasn't it, to that design process that we were talking about, Browning, the Medical Research Council, etc. This flap across, which you can see in some of those earlier drawings that way, as opposed to the straight opening down the front with the original early Denisons, the Windac, etc. So again, more to come. Goodness knows how many, you know, other stories I know that you'll have out there, that how we've researched things, find out about things, nuggets of information that to me, and I hope to you, helps bring our subject around the thing alive a bit more, gives us those extra layers of interest. And for me, the Denison being such, as I keep going on, this overused word iconic, but it is one of those, isn't it, what we all kind of, blokes of a certain age type thing, I keep saying, you know, we all found that quite a bit of a thrill for the movies, for the photographs, for the time in history it was being used, and then of course being continued, and that thought of that Second World War veteran hanging on to it to do the gardening in, you know, great stuff. So I'll end up, Finn's here still enjoying himself in the early morning. Thank you again so much to John Baker, and I just want to mention his team there, Ben Hill, wonderful as well, being very helpful. Alan Pryor, they've got some great volunteers there that again really help an organisation forward, and with the contacts and being very friendly and, you know, asking all the right questions. And again, well, I met George Heyman there, a young student doing his work placement there at the Airborne Forces, you history graduates, you know, where all those places you might be able to do a placement, help them and get some real good benefits. So it's great meeting George. And of course, I must say thank you to John as well for taking us up there. But thank you so much. Do remember, I gather you've got to remember to subscribe or press all the right buttons, otherwise you won't get notified. And all these things I keep forgetting, I'm remembering to say. But on a lovely day from Finn, myself, and Denison Smocks story, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. As we're aware, the Panzer II was the main constituent